Regina, Mater misericordiae, vita dulcedo, estes nostra salve.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Lord, to you.
Jesus took Peter, James, and his brother John, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, conversing with him. Then Peter said to Jesus in reply, Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud cast a shadow over them. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell prostrate and were very much afraid. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, Rise and do not be afraid. And when the disciples raised their eyes, they saw no one else but Jesus alone. As they were coming down from the mountain, Jesus charged them, Do not tell the vision to anyone, until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. The Gospel of the Lord. In my own personal prayer this week, I have been meditating on how often fear and anger dictate the terms and lead me astray. Perhaps that's not an issue with any of you. How many times does that happen? Fear and anger dictate the terms and lead us astray. We do or say things we regret. If you go a little earlier in the gospel, before this passage we read today, Jesus explains to the disciples that he is going to go to Jerusalem and suffer and die. And Peter, he says, You're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Just before this, Peter says that. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. But when Jesus says that he has to go to Jerusalem and suffer and die, Peter gets upset. This can't be. It's a hint of anger, but fear. If this is what's going to happen to him, it might happen to me. I'm afraid, and I'm afraid for him. And Jesus says, Get behind me, Satan. That anger and that fear is not of God. And it must be expelled. And Jesus goes so far as to say to Peter, You're not thinking as God does. When anger and fear start to influence our thoughts, we need to be careful and cautious. It might be time to let a decision wait. It might be time to let a word from our mouth hold on for a minute. Or sometimes when there's a real problem festering, I like to let it sit in a tomb for 3 days to see what happens. And often it just kind of goes away and we can act with a cooler head. It's amazing how much new life can happen after 3 days in a tomb. Abraham is asked by God to take a journey. And you can imagine how he felt. Abraham is living, when God appears to Abraham or reveals himself, Abraham's living in a land that we know as Kuwait today. He's an extremely successful merchant. He's a man of wealth and of great means. And all of a sudden he hears in prayer, "Oh, Abraham, I want you to move." And Abraham trusts in God. He trusts that word that comes from God. He doesn't respond in the anger and the fear. Although I suspect they don't tell you this in the scriptures, but it wouldn't surprise me if he had to work through that a little bit. But he trusts, and there's the response. Who do we trust? Do we trust that voice that comes from the pit of hell? Or do we trust the voice of God that calls us to new life? Shortly, we're going to read a prayer called the preface. It's just before the Eucharistic prayer in the Mass. And it says this about the Transfiguration. After he had told his disciples of his coming death on the holy mountain, he manifested to them his glory, to show even by the testimony of the law and the prophets that the passion leads to glory and resurrection. Sometimes our anger and our fear comes as a result of God calling us to something that may be difficult or something new to us. And I've also found that when you look at, say, Peter, James, and John, when you get close to Jesus and he starts edging toward Calvary, it can become uncomfortable. And so we're assured in the Transfiguration that the passion leads to glory, even the passion in our own lives. And yet, how many times have we let anger and fear lead us astray and even lead us away from Christ? Well, here is a little remedy for us. Paul says in his letter to the Timothy that we quote today, "Bear your share of hardship with strength that comes from God." So this is not a time when that fear and anger comes, it's not a time to go turn away from God. It's not a time to turn away from his mercy and his love. Instead, Jesus invites us to go up to the mountain to pray with him, like he did Peter, James, and John. To go to the mountain to take some time with Jesus and to delight in Jesus. You get the idea with all the light that's going on that mountain and the disciples there, you get the idea that this began as kind of a nice, delightful journey. Peter, James, John, just the three of you, I want you to come with me. We're going to go up that mountain. We're going to just spend some great time together and delight in one another. And this is what our prayer does. It brings us to a place to delight in Jesus. And then we should be remembering who we are as we delight in Jesus. In the words of St. Matthew earlier, he's quoting God the Father, who in this gospel speaks only twice. God the Father speaks in this gospel only twice. He says, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased." It's not only a statement about Jesus, but it's a statement of all the baptized who have Christ in them. This is my beloved, whom I'm well pleased. This is default mode for God. He loves us. That's the baseline of where we all are with him. He loves us unconditionally. This is my beloved, with whom I'm well pleased. We remember our place with God and how much he loves us. Can you imagine if Adam and Eve, before listening to the serpent, first said to themselves, "You know, our Father who loves us, that doesn't sound like something that would come from him." And so we see the difference between the sound of the anger and the fury and the fear and the sound of the Father who loves us. He delights in you. And you remember also what the Father said about Jesus. here in this transfiguration, he makes this well known to Peter, James, and John. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. Listen to Jesus. And in these two places in the gospel, in Matthew chapter 3 and here today in Matthew chapter 17, the Father is literally saying, I have nothing else to say but point you to Jesus, because these two insertions of his words are all about Jesus and pointing to Jesus. The Father has nothing to say except the name of Jesus for us. And so we turn to him. Even now in our time of Lent, we may wrestle a little bit with fear and with anger. And so we turn to Jesus, because this is the answer that the Father gives us. Jesus, in whom we delight, in whom we find our identity, and in whom he takes away all fear.
Regina Celi, letare